picture's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with a review of A History of Violence by Édouard Louis, a French novel translated into English this year by Lauren Stein. And if any of you have read Louis' first novel, translated into English, The End of Eddie, and didn't much care for it, I do urge you to give this one a try because the translator's different. I thought Édouard Louis' first novel, The End of Eddie, was a flawed novel, but also one of the most searing portrayals of gay shame that I have ever read in fiction. So I had a mixed feelings about it, but it made me want to follow Édouard Louis' literary career from there, and here is his second novel, at least his second novel to be translated into English. Like I say, different translator, and I thought the writing here was fantastic. First of all, this is a novel about male rape. In other words, it's about a gay man named Édouard Louis. So how autobiographical the story is, I don't know, and I didn't do any research, but it's about a young gay man named Édouard Louis who picks up a stranger walking home on Christmas Eve, slightly tipsy, brings the guy into his apartment, and eventually Édouard gets violently raped. So it's a harrowing story, of course. I would say that the novel doesn't focus on the actual rape for more than a few pages. My memory may be slightly off. How do I want to say that? Of course, that's what the book is about, but really what this novel is about is trauma and the numbness in the wake of trauma. So if you're worried about not being able to handle a lot of violent detail, there isn't much. What there is I think, quite profound exploration of those early days after a violent trauma and the role storytelling and the role friendship and family play in those first small baby steps to healing. I hesitate to use the word healing. I think Édouard Louis might crinkle his nose at such a airy-fairy word, but certainly that's part of the story as well. But really, the only thing I want to say, I've talked about this book on a couple Friday reads. This was a buddy read with Ollie Bliss. A wonderful buddy read. He did it on audio, and I did it in print, and we had a great time. And it's a heavy book to buddy read with anybody, so it, I think, brought us closer together as friends. So that was cool. What I absolutely loved about this novel in a 5-star way was the narrative point of view. Édouard, back in his hometown, the countryside of France, I don't know where in France, but rinky-dink, the boonies of France, and he grew up in a very kind of hick family, lower class, working poor family. And he's back in his hometown visiting his sister, and they have a very complicated relationship, mutually judgmental and conflictual relationship. And he has told his sister what happened to him. And 70% of this story, of this text, is Édouard in the bedroom listening through the closed door to his sister telling her husband the story. And I thought that was brilliant and worked extremely well. And occasionally, Édouard, while listening, will interject in italics to clarify, correct, expand upon, or comment upon her version of his story directly to the reader. And there's just a little bit of that. But when he does it, it adds another rich layer to the story. And also, there is straightforward first-person narrative, not mediated through his prejudiced, bigoted, opinionated sister, where he tells his story, tells other parts of the story in a more direct way. And the interplay between the quoted version that his sister's telling her husband, his italicized interjections into that story, and his straightforward narration, for me, worked powerfully to tell a story of trauma and numbness. Again, it's the details of the sexual assault don't take up too much space in this book, but of course that's the core of the story. But really, the story he's telling through those three perspectives is about those early days of just losing your mind, losing your bearings, being unable to feel very much. And what do you do? And part of what he does is fixate on the story in a way he can't stop telling it, he can't stop talking about it, and he can't stop thinking about how the police are taking down his story, how the doctor is writing down his story, how his sister's narrating his story, and he's completely fixated on it, yet he himself has barely begun to process the enormity of what has happened to him. And I just thought it was powerful. Enough said. I'm going to read you a little bit of a long passage, just like a page and a half maybe, or I'm not sure, that shows you how the three narrative strategies fit together. I should say there's nothing about the actual physical assault, but this part of the story is about some of the moments leading up to that. So there's no violence here, but there is a sense of dread and tenseness in the story, because we know, the reader and the people who are telling it know what's about to happen. But it's not a violent passage. So the beginning of this quote is Clara, his sister. I'd forgotten that she was named, but it's right there. Clara is his sister. So we start with Clara's Clara talking to her husband. So pay attention to the italicized portion that's embedded in the middle of Clara's telling, and then when the quotation marks finish, that this is Édouard writing first-person narrative reflected in a bit more tranquility with some distance. And the name of his attacker is Rita, or Rita, I'm not sure the pronunciation. His friend Jeffrey told him the next day, "You should have let him leave with the phone. A phone is nothing, just a piece of plastic." Meanwhile, Édouard doesn't know why, but for some reason he can't let it go about the phone. He starts up all over again, asking the guy to give it back. Instead of leaving or changing the subject now that the guy's calmed down, what does he do? He asks for the phone. He won't let it be. But if you ask me, it's not really about the phone. That friend of his, Jeffrey, is way off the mark, but how could he understand? He doesn't know him as well as I do. I'm telling you, it could have been anything, a pencil, a piece of jewelry, or even a person, a hostage, whatever. It would have been the same to Édouard, because it wasn't about the phone. It's about these fixations he gets. It's a kind of insanity. No matter what it was, it would have been the same. Not for me, mind you. I'd have got the hell out of there a long time ago, but for him. Before the night you met Rita, you would think the way she does, but now you know better. Before that night, I had always imagined, if I were facing death, if I were trapped in a burning house, or with a murderer, whatever the circumstance might be, I would have done everything I could to extricate myself, that I'd never have given up. I'd thought the imminence of death would have doubled my strength and my courage, would have revealed a power, an ability to shout, to fight, to escape, to run, to defend myself, that even I had never suspected. Of course, in the movies, in newspapers and magazines, I'd seen characters capitulate to their own deaths and surrender, but I thought I was different. And these images always filled me with a wave of disgust and contempt as I watched them give up the fight so quickly. I thought, I'm much stronger than they are. It was pure insanity, believe me. He kept on asking and asking for that phone, and I bet he asked for it more than he even let on. Maybe I could have made him go away in one of his moments of calm. He would come close to me, and in all my trembling and stammering, I never noticed how many other things he'd slipped into the pockets of his jacket. Over the next month, and even the next day, I found that various things of mine were no longer there, that they'd vanished. I didn't notice that Christmas Eve. In any case, they were things that didn't matter, but he really had emptied my apartment, so to speak, and he did it with incredible discretion, since I was sure my eyes had been on him the whole time. I so badly wanted to make the most of his last seconds in my apartment, to admire him while he was in the shower, or, rather, I thought my eyes were on him. That's how I remember it, even now, though clearly that's not possible, or he couldn't have taken all those things. Okay, so that is a great example of the three narrative points of view, narrative strategies that Edward Louis uses to tell this powerful story. And I just want to close on one other note that's more thematic, which is it's very subtle, and I'm not going to say too much about it, but the way this novel ends reminded me of Andrew Holleran's 1978 novel Dancer from the Dance, in the way it provides a conclusion that highlights, in sharp contrast to what has gone before, the power of friendship. That's all I'm going to say. And that was a really, for me, subtle but extremely effective, powerful conclusion to a novel that got all the way inside me. History of Violence by Edward Louis. I recommend it highly. Thanks for watching.